Hello, welcome to the podcast. My name is Alex, and thank you for tuning in to Bladed Game Chats. And so you might be wondering or asking yourself, what is this show all about? Well, I'm here to offer an honest and thorough discussion of my personal experiences playing video games firsthand. So I want to create a space to appreciate games, to talk about games, and see what their contribution is to the gaming industry and culture. So if you're wondering what a video game is about, or wanting to hear a full deep dive conversation, then I'm here to help make decisions, review video games, and talk about what it means to people and how they inspire creativity in their own lives. So, today's episode, we're going to be pointing our blade to Moonlighter. Now, Moonlighter is developed by a company named Digital Sun. They are a Spanish indie studio, and Moonlighter can be available to play on Microsoft Windows, Mac OS, Linux, PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo Switch, and many more. Now, let's dive into the basic premise of what this video game is about. The quick description on Wikipedia says, single-player action RPG video game about a shopkeeper who takes care of his business during the day and at night becomes a dungeon crawler adventurer. So right off the bat, this is a single-player game. It is also free for Game Pass for Xbox players and is $19.99 for all of the other gamers out there. So let's dive into what kind of audience would be interested in this type of video game. Well, I would like to call this a roguelite video game, and that's different from the typical roguelike video games. And so the different terminology that I'm describing here is that a roguelike is a type of video game where you can continue going as far as you want, either until you die, or until the game can't offer you any more things. And a quick example of this off the top of my mind is Gunfire Reborn. This is a type of game where you can continue going through the levels as far as you can, and if you die, you get sent back to the lobby. And so you might be asking yourself, then what's the benefit from keep going into the levels and doing them over and over and over again? And well, the answer to that is the more you play the game, the more powerful you become. So say you go through a dungeon and you can only go through level 1 or level 2, and then you end up dying and being sent back to the lobby. Well, now you have that experience to increase your power, your equipment, stuff like that, where you can then go back into the dungeon and go past level 2, go past level 3 even. And the more you play, the more powerful you are. And so, with Moonlighter, this is a roguelite. A roguelite is similar in the sense of you can keep going for as much as you can until you die or the game doesn't allow you to go any further, but there are specific elements of the story, of the narrative, and of the gameplay that remain consistent. Things like, oh, you always have the town to work on, or your shop to sell things to your citizens. Whereas to a game where you just get sent back to the main menu, there are things that you are allowed to keep even if you die in the dungeon. So let's take a moment to dive into the realms, or the world build and the story. So my first impressions of this was when I started playing the game, the developers actually recommended that you play on a hard mode difficulty as the default. And so at first I was kind of thrown off by that because normally you would play on like a normal or an easy, but this time around you're actually recommended to play on a harder difficulty. And so at first I was a little like, do I actually play on hard or do I make it easier for myself? And so my first decision was to, you know what, go with hard mode because that's what the developers wanted me to play. That's how the game is supposed to play. Let's go with that. Now let me remind you all about the premise of the story. You play as Will, the protagonist, who is a shopkeeper owner, and he is trying to continue to build up his family reputation. His family either passed or moved on from the town, and he's the only one living at the shop. And throughout his whole life, he has been told, you can't go into the dungeon. It is dangerous. It's not worth your life. Don't risk it. But Will, obviously, his whole life has been dreaming about going into these dungeons, fighting monsters, collecting loot. And so when the family leaves or passes, he's left alone to think, how am I supposed to continue the business of the family, keeping the shop alive, keeping customers coming in and buying merchandise. How can Will keep his living? He finally decides, you know what, it's time in my life to do what I want and become the adventurer that I've always dreamed of becoming, thus kickstarting the hook of the story, going into those dungeons as Will and fighting those creatures, exploring the pre-generated dungeons and levels, and collecting that loot to bring back to the shop and sell to the town. Now, what I really appreciate about this game is the art style and the design and the soundtrack. Even as like an 8-bit pixelated game, it is still aesthetically pleasing and dynamic, and the movement of flow when you're like swinging a sword or shooting a bow, and even like opening chests is satisfying. I would describe it as relaxing to the eye, and nothing is ever over dramatic. And to support this, each dungeon is themed differently. There are 4 dungeons to start off with, and 1 mystery 5th dungeon. And the way the game works is as you complete these dungeons, you get these keys, and it marks off the map of how many dungeons you've completed, and basically unlocks that 5th dungeon. And so, relating back to the art style and the soundtrack and the design, these dungeons give a taste of what it's like coming into these different generated rooms, and there's always a piece of the puzzle that is being discovered and leading us to the conclusion and the reasons for why the dungeons were locked up in the first place, and why everybody has been avoiding them in the town. Why is Will the only one willing to go in? And how does Will kickstart all of these other adventurers into the town of going back into these dungeons as a sort of thing that was not supposed to be talked about, but now that Will is going through these dungeons and completing them, people are starting to realize that this can be actually completed. And even with all of these themes and the art style, the soundtrack is what really fits with these dungeons. It gives a distinct feeling and connects you to what you're seeing and what you're hearing and what you're even fighting, and these creatures are all themed around and separated by all of these different dungeons, which makes you want to complete all of these dungeons to unlock that secret mystery behind the door. So all of these different elements sort of combine and create these emotional and memorable moments, and one of the first ones that come to mind for me is whenever I defeated the first boss of the first dungeon, because at the time I was still playing on the difficulty hard, which is what they recommended, and coming back and learning his attack patterns, you end up dying and raging sometimes, but coming back every time, and that satisfaction of, oh my god, I finally beat him and I finally get the dungeon key, is something that I really think players are drawn to, and has similar elements to Dark Souls or Elden Ring, where you have to come back, fight the same boss over and over, learn his moves, dodge at the right time, and fully immerse yourself into the character and into the gameplay. So let's move on to the mechanics and controls. I would say that there is sort of a learning curve if you're so used to playing first-person shooters, for example. This is a third-person game. In addition, when you leave the dungeon and come back to the shop, you have to figure out what items are worth selling, how much are they worth, and how much would they be worth if the specific item is in high or low demand, or even neutral. So, for example, if an item is too expensive or too cheap, a customer might come into the shop, look at the item, either be upset if it's overpriced, or think that it's underpriced and think that it's a steal, which is also bad. So you're trying to find that middle ground of how much could I sell this item during this day for the right customer, and figure out that neutral cost. Now, coming back to what it's like fighting in some of these dungeons, something that I dislike is that when you're aiming at a creature, you could be facing in the wrong direction, because the character is sort of accustomed to be in like the north, south, west to east poles of movement. But with practice, there are easier ways to maneuver with the dodging mechanic. But I find myself always trying to aim at something, but my sword is in the wrong direction, or my face is in the wrong direction for it to connect. Now, let's take a moment to discuss community, and if the developers have any good relationship with their fan base. So from what I've seen, there are tons of Discord servers, tons of engagement opportunity, and even a DLC that has recently come out. So therefore, I think this game is thriving, and honestly very underrated. And even the playability of the game connects with an audience that is looking for something practical and something relaxing that they can just come home to, put on, and enjoy that discovery and that exploration. It is a small game that immerses you fully, and I find myself completely invested in. You are going through this world, collecting, selling, exploring, building, grinding, and figuring out all of the different buffs for your weapons or armor and enchantments and potions that I honestly think a gamer at any level could pick this up and it would be a fan favorite. So at this point in the show, I would really like to take a moment and discuss the meaning behind Moonlight, or the meaning it means to me. So for example, I play this game with my girlfriend and we really bond over it. We take turns shopkeeping and dungeon crawling. This is the sort of game that everybody can enjoy and requires a lot less attention span than larger games like Stardew Valley, for example. This is a very straightforward and simple, but that is the appeal of it. It's simple yet interesting at the same time, but also has a lot of lore, has a lot of different strategies to learn how to play. The story itself really teaches you that no matter how many people tell you you cannot do something, if you push yourself and if you really are determined to follow what you want to do in your life, you can achieve it. No matter how many times you have to get back up and keep going, you'll always push further than you were last. And so, I recommend, for those who are just looking for a nice story, a relaxing experience, play on normal mode. Don't listen to the developers and want to play on a harder difficulty, even though it says it's defaulted to it. But if you're looking for a challenge, I recommend playing on the default and or going higher than that. So, I fully recommend playing, give it a try, you will get addicted very quickly, and I would have to rate this a 8, which is rare. It's a gem that is appreciated and very underrated. This is your sign, and explore the world of that shopkeeper and the dungeon adventurer. And if you made it this far, thank you so much for listening to Bladed Game Chats. Tune in next time where we point our blade to the next video game and find out what they mean to you. Bye!